He thought he could grab the old woman right on the street, but he didn't know who she was. A minute later, his world was turned upside down. What kind of power could turn a sheriff's life upside down in seconds? Subscribe and write in the comments where you're watching from. Real Stories Diary wants to hear from you. The sun rose early over Ryan, Oklahoma, spilling gold across the fields and rooftops like warm honey. It was the kind of morning that promised stillness, where even the cicadas held their breath for a few lingering minutes before beginning their shrill chorus. On Main Street, the town's humble artery, banners from last month's parade still fluttered on crooked lampposts, their edges curling from dust and sun. The old grain elevator cast its long, crooked shadow across the empty street, and a light breeze whispered through the cottonwoods lining the edge of the town square. Wilma Scarberry stood on the worn front porch of her house, the same white-clapboard cottage her late husband had built with his own hands more than half a century ago. A hanging basket of petunias swayed near her shoulder, and she adjusted the wide-brimmed straw hat on her head before stepping down the steps, careful to avoid the crack in the third board. She knew this house like she knew the contours of her own aging hands, every squeak in the floorboards, every uneven spot in the flagstone path, each one a memory tethered to her long life and Ryan. She wore a modest, pale lavender dress with a thin belt at the waist and comfortable shoes. Nothing fancy. Her hair, silver and thick, was pulled back into a soft knot at the nape of her neck, and her delicate frame carried itself with a quiet dignity. In her left hand, she held a canvas shopping bag, folded neatly. In her right, she grasped the handle of a small cart with wheels, one that squeaked faintly whenever she turned. She didn't mind the noise. It reminded her she was still moving, still independent. Today was market day, and Wilma liked to go early, before the crowds. The farmers set up their stalls just after dawn. Local tomatoes, still warm from the greenhouse, fresh eggs in reused cartons, jars of honey with hand-painted labels, and peaches so ripe they stained your fingers. She had a short list: butter, green beans, and, if Old Man Dillard had them, a jar of his muscadine jelly. Her steps were slow but deliberate. As she made her way toward the town square, several passers-by greeted her. "Morning, Miss Wilma," called out a teen riding a bicycle, his voice crackling with early adolescence. "Good morning, Corey." "Tell your mama I said hello," she replied with a smile. "Ma'am," said another man, tipping his hat, a rancher she had known since he was knee-high. People in Ryan knew who Wilma Scarberry was, not because she asked to be remembered, but because she had never left. She had taught 3 generations of children at the elementary school, chaired the church committee, organized food drives, sat with widows after funerals, and stood on the sidelines of more high school football games than she could count. And of course, she was the grandmother of Chuck Norris. Not that she mentioned it much. To most folks, he was Carlos's boy, her only grandson, the one who went off and became famous. She kept a few clippings in a drawer, along with an old VHS tape of Walker, Texas Ranger, but she didn't bring it up. People had a way of changing how they looked at you when they knew you were connected to someone important. Wilma had never needed that. Her presence alone, steady and grounded, was enough. But what happens when a quiet morning turns into a confrontation no one saw coming? Stay with Real Stories Diary to find out. The market square came into view, flanked by faded brick buildings and the Methodist church steeple towering over them. Stalls were already half full, with shoppers chatting and vendors unpacking their goods. Wilma walked among them, exchanging quiet pleasantries, picking through the produce, careful with her selections. She paused to admire a basket of okra and was just about to ask the price when a commotion broke the gentle rhythm of the morning. Voices rose a few feet away, near the parking lot, where a group of teenage boys, 2 black, 1 Latino, and 1 white, stood nervously beside their bicycles. Towering over them was a tall, broad-shouldered man in a tan uniform, with a sheriff's badge glinting on his chest. His nameplate read D. Cross. Sheriff Denny Cross was a new addition to Ryan, elected just over a year ago in a close and contentious race. He was in his late 30s, with short-cropped blonde hair, a muscular build, and a voice that carried more weight than wisdom. He had come from a neighboring county with promises of order, discipline, and respect for authority. What he lacked in temperament, he made up for in ambition, and he didn't take kindly to public contradiction. The boys stood stiffly as he berated them, something about loitering, about suspicious behavior. Wilma watched closely. They weren't causing a disturbance. They weren't shouting or damaging property. They were laughing minutes before, tossing a small football between them, one of them trying to impress a girl nearby. But Sheriff Cross didn't like what he saw, or rather, he didn't like that they weren't afraid of him. Wilma moved closer, her steps firm but unhurried. Her presence wasn't loud, but it carried. People turned slightly as she approached, sensing her intent. "Excuse me, Sheriff," she said calmly. "Is there a problem here?" Cross turned to her, his face still taut from the confrontation. For a moment, he didn't seem to recognize her, just another voice interrupting his show of power. But then he took in the gray hair, the upright posture, the composure. Something in his face shifted, an ironic smile playing at the corner of his mouth. "Not unless you make one, ma'am," he said with theatrical politeness. Wilma didn't flinch. She nodded once to the boys, who looked at her with something between relief and awe. Then she looked back at Cross. "These boys live here. They go to school here. Maybe instead of barking at them, you could learn their names." A few people nearby looked up from their vegetables. Cross's jaw tightened. The corner of his smile twitched. "Well," he said, "I suppose you're an expert in law enforcement, too." "No," Wilma said, "but I do know what abuse of authority looks like. I've lived through enough of it." His smile disappeared. "I suggest you keep walking," he said. She didn't answer, just turned and resumed her path through the stalls. The cartwheels squeaked behind her, their rhythm steady. The sheriff stared at her back for a long moment, his hand resting heavily on his belt. The boys left soon after, but Wilma felt the tension linger in the air like dust after a truck rolls through. She finished her shopping in silence, greeted a few more familiar faces, but her thoughts stayed fixed on that moment. She had known men like Sheriff Cross before, not just in uniform, but in meetings, in church, in office chairs, behind polished desks. Men who saw her gray hair and calm voice and thought that made her small, invisible, easy to dismiss. But not today. The sun was higher now, heating the sidewalk under her feet as she began the walk back home. The market noise faded behind her. Along the way, she paused beneath the magnolia trees, their thick petals dropping slowly onto the pavement. Her cart bumped over a crack in the sidewalk, and she stopped to steady it. Somewhere ahead, she knew the house waited, the same one with the chime on the porch and the soft creak in the floor near the front window. Maybe she'd make herself some sweet tea. Maybe she'd sit out for a while and read the paper. Maybe Chuck would arrive early, like he sometimes did, with that quiet grin that reminded her more of his grandfather than his movies. But first, she had to walk the last 3 blocks, past the library, past the alley, and past a sheriff with something to prove. She didn't look back. She didn't need to. The air behind her had already begun to shift. Something dark was growing in its place, not loud, not immediate, but steady, like a storm crawling across an open field. She clutched the cart handle tighter and walked on, not because she wasn't afraid, but because she knew the danger never came when you expected it. It came when you were dignified, when you stood tall, when you reminded someone that they couldn't control the whole world, and that was often when they tried the hardest. What Wilma Scarberry couldn't yet know was that the next few minutes would turn into something far more than an insult in a marketplace. It would become a reckoning. And this time, she wouldn't be alone. The wind had picked up slightly as Wilma left the last edge of the market behind her. The crowd had thinned. There was a heaviness in the air now, not from heat, but from something more subtle, more pressing. The weight of being watched, perhaps. She didn't glance over her shoulder, but she knew. Years had taught her to feel when eyes followed, when danger pressed close without yet speaking. She crossed the street near the library, its red brick facade quiet and still at this hour, and turned down the narrow side lane that led toward her home. This wasn't the first time she'd taken this shortcut, a simple, slightly uneven stretch of pavement that ran between the back of the library and the old post office. It shaved off a good 5 minutes from her usual walk, and on most days, it was unremarkable. Today, though, each step felt denser, as if the very sidewalk resisted her weight. Magnolia petals from the trees along the street clung to the hem of her dress as she moved forward. The squeak of her cart, once comforting, now sounded too loud in the hush of the alley. She slowed, suddenly aware of the silence pressing in. The only sound she could hear beyond her wheels was her own breathing, and the faint echo of a second pair of footsteps, not far behind. She didn't stop. She didn't speed up, either. The rhythm of her walk remained steady, deliberate, controlled. She knew better than to show fear. It had never protected anyone like her. She'd survived a husband's war years, a segregated school system, hospital waiting rooms where people spoke over her like she wasn't there, and 1,000 small indignities that tried to shrink her presence. She had learned not to flinch. The footsteps grew closer, 1 or 2 long strides more, and she felt the presence of another body invade her space. "Ma'am," came the voice behind her, low, clipped, and unmistakably familiar. She stopped. The sound of the cart's wheels ceased with a final whine, and she turned slowly. Sheriff Denny Cross stood less than 5 feet from her. His tan uniform looked somehow tighter than it had that morning, the top buttons undone, the badge catching the sun. His jaw was clenched, eyes squinting slightly, as if trying to decide how serious to make this moment. One hand rested loosely on his belt near the flashlight holster. The other hung by his side, fingers twitching. "You got a minute?" he asked, though it wasn't a question. Wilma gave him a calm, neutral look. "I'm walking home," she replied, her voice even. "You went out of your way to embarrass me today," he said. "Made a scene." "I didn't raise my voice. I offered perspective." "You undermined an officer in front of the public," he said, stepping forward. Wilma held her ground. "I spoke up." He smiled then, tight, humorless. "Funny how people think that makes them brave. What do you want, Sheriff?" His eyes narrowed. "You live around here." "You know I do. Mind proving it?" The moment hung there, heavy with implication. She had no legal obligation to show him anything, but that didn't mean he would walk away. She could see it now, the lines in his face, the burn behind his eyes. This wasn't about protocol. It wasn't even about ego. This was something deeper, a man who had grown used to silence and submission and was now itching to reclaim control. "I've lived on Hawthorne for over 50 years, she said plainly. "I'm going home." She moved to step around him. He didn't let her. His arm shot out, not fast, not violent at first, but firm. His fingers closed around her upper arm, and his grip tightened like a screw. She staggered slightly, her cart tipping to one side, its contents rattling. "Don't walk away from me," he said. She looked down at his hand, then up at him. "You're hurting me." He leaned in. "You think you can talk to me like that and just go on with your day?" Wilma didn't answer. She tried to pull her arm back, gently at first, but his grip only grew stronger. The change in his expression was almost imperceptible, a shift from aggression to something more dangerous, more unstable, and in one swift, deliberate motion, he yanked her closer and shoved her backward. The brick wall behind her absorbed the impact, but her shoulders scraped hard against the mortar. Her hat tumbled to the ground. One of her shoes slipped half off. She tried to steady herself, hands grasping at the rough wall behind her. Then he placed his forearm across her chest, just below her collarbone, and leaned in, pressing. It wasn't a chokehold, not exactly, but it was a clear message. He had done this before. He knew how far he could push without leaving a bruise that would hold up in court. The breath caught in Wilma's throat. She pressed her palms against his arm, not to strike or fight, just to hold herself upright. Her back ached, her ribs protested, but she didn't cry out. She looked him dead in the eyes. "You don't get to do this," she said, her voice rasping. "You're resisting," he growled. "I'm standing," she whispered. For a brief, surreal moment, time slowed. Somewhere in the distance, a car passed without stopping. A bird flitted across the sky. The wind moved the magnolia leaves, but here in this narrow alley, the world was silent. Sheriff Cross pushed harder, her knees bent slightly, but she didn't fall. He was breathing heavier now. He expected fear, tears, pleading, collapse. Instead, he got stillness. Then a voice, distant but sharp, pierced the quiet. "Hey, get your hands off her." It came from across the street. A woman, elderly herself, holding a bag of groceries, was staring with wide eyes. She dropped the bag. Apples spilled across the sidewalk. Cross turned his head slightly. "Your business, lady," he barked. That was his mistake. The second his attention drifted, the pressure on Wilma's chest lightened. She took a shallow breath and used it to plant her feet again. Her hands were still trembling, her dress bunched and wrinkled from the wall behind her, but her eyes stayed fixed on his. He turned back to her. His expression now bordered on panic, confusion threading into anger. The spell of control he had cast was slipping. And then a sound came that neither of them expected. Tires screeched just around the corner. A truck, dark gray, its engine roaring, tore into the alley's entrance. Its tires bit the pavement hard before coming to a jerking stop. Sheriff Cross straightened. The driver's door opened. And Wilma, even in the haze of pain and pressure, felt something loosen in her chest. A figure stepped out tall, broad-shouldered, in worn jeans and a button-down shirt. His hair was tousled, his walk purposeful. "Chuck." He didn't say a word as he approached. His eyes were locked on the scene, the sheriff with his arm still against his grandmother's chest, her body pinned against a brick wall, the overturned cart at her feet, the contents scattered across the ground like spilled dignity. Chuck didn't run. He walked slowly, deliberately, like a man who knew that every second was an extension of a decision already made. Each step radiated calm, but beneath that calm was a storm, the kind of storm trained to hit its mark without noise or flare. Wilma didn't speak. She didn't need to. Her eyes met his, and in that gaze, everything was understood. Cross turned to face the new threat, instinctively moving back half a step. "This doesn't concern you," he started to say, but Chuck didn't stop. He stepped in. Cross's hand went to his belt. Chuck's own hands moved faster than instinct, faster than the eye could track. A subtle shift of weight, a twist of the hip, and in one fluid motion, he struck the sheriff's wrist, disarming the gesture before it became a weapon. Cross staggered. Chuck's left hand caught him by the collar. A twist, a pivot. Cross was on the ground. It was not showy. It was not violent. It was surgical. Wilma's breath came back in sudden, shallow bursts. She braced herself against the wall, legs shaken now not from fear, but from release. Chuck turned to her, his voice low and steady. "Are you okay?" She nodded. He turned back to Cross, who lay gasping, humiliated, not injured, at least not yet, but thoroughly disarmed in every way that mattered. Chuck said nothing more, but he didn't need to, because now people were watching, and there would be no walking away from what had just happened. For a long moment, the alley hung in a charged silence that seemed to stretch beyond the boundaries of time. Sheriff Cross lay on the asphalt, struggling to orient himself. The authority he once wore like a badge of invincibility shattered at his feet. Chuck stood above him, feet planted firmly, arms lowered but alert, not aggressive, just ready, the way he always was when he didn't need to prove anything. His body said what words never could. And Wilma, bruised but upright, remained pressed against the brick wall, one hand trembling slightly near her chest, the other still clinging to the last sliver of composure not taken from her by violence. Chuck turned to her once more, stepping carefully over the fallen cart. He offered his hand, not in pity, but in respect, and she took it. Their palms met with a shared understanding not just of blood, but of something deeper, history, dignity, and the inheritance of endurance. He helped her gently back to her feet, and she stood tall again, straightening the creases in her dress with slow, methodical movements. A trickle of blood ran from a scrape on her forearm, but she said nothing about it. Instead, she nodded once to her grandson, the way she used to when handing him a chore or sending him off to school. A quiet affirmation. "I'm still here." By now, a few townspeople had begun to appear at the edges of the scene. An older couple paused on the corner, hesitant, but curious. A young man with a smartphone had already begun filming, his voice low as he narrated under his breath. Another woman peeked from her porch, her hand halfway to her mouth. They hadn't seen the start of it, but they saw enough of the sheriff on the ground, Wilma with blood on her arm, and Chuck Norris standing over them both like a living contradiction, calm yet capable of fury, composed yet coiled like a spring. Sheriff Cross sat up slowly, one hand bracing his weight, the other patting at the badge on his chest, as if checking it still belonged to him. His eyes darted between Chuck and the growing crowd. He opened his mouth, but whatever words he had prepared dissolved into the air, too fragile, cyano-fragile to survive the weight of what had just occurred. Chuck didn't gloat. He didn't puff his chest or raise his voice. He simply stepped forward once, and that movement alone was enough to command silence. His voice, when it finally came, was low and even. "You need to leave," he said to the sheriff. Not a suggestion, not a threat, a verdict. Cross-blinked, jaw-twitching, pride scrambling for something to hold on to, but there was nothing left. He rose slowly, dusted off his pants with jerky, almost childlike movements, and took 2 awkward steps backward. His boots scraped the pavement with more noise than necessary. Then, like a man stumbling out of a fight he never knew he'd already lost, he turned and walked away, eyes down, lips tight, muttering something inaudible to himself as he disappeared around the corner. The onlookers watched him go, then turned their eyes back to Chuck and Wilma. It was as if the alley itself had witnessed a shift, not just in power, but in narrative. No one cheered. No one applauded. But the air felt heavier now, laced with something irreversible. Chuck helped Wilma retrieve her cart. Most of the produce had spilled, bruised, and broken on the asphalt, but she didn't seem to care. She straightened the handle, brushed dust from the frame, and adjusted her hat, which had landed beside the wall. Then, without ceremony, they walked the rest of the way home together, side by side, saying nothing. Their silence was not empty. It was full of breath, of awareness, of consequences still gathering themselves just beyond the edge of the horizon. Back at the house, Chuck guided her up the steps with the same care he had as a boy when carrying her groceries in from the car. Once inside, he fetched the first aid kit from under the sink while she sat in her usual chair by the window. The sun had shifted now, casting a soft golden light across the wooden floorboards. Dust motes danced in Warden in the air, spinning in slow circles. Outside, the sound of a distant lawnmower buzzed faintly, as if the world were trying to pretend it hadn't just tilted. Wilma didn't flinch as Chuck cleaned the scrape on her arm. She winced only once when he pressed gauze to the deepest spot, but otherwise remained still, watching the trees outside sway in the breeze. Her breath came steady again now, though a quiet exhaustion sat behind her eyes. Chuck finally spoke. "I didn't expect to find you like that." She met his gaze. "I didn't expect to be found. I saw the video. Someone posted it to a local group. I was already in the truck." She nodded. "Good thing I taught you not to be late." He gave a faint smile. "Good thing you taught me everything." For a few moments, the silence returned, this time softened by the familiarity of home. Wilma reached for a glass of water and took a sip, her hand no longer trembling. Then she set it down carefully and looked at her grandson. "I need you to understand something, Charles," she said, using his full name the way only family ever did. "This didn't happen because I argued with him or because he's new or angry or didn't know who I was. It happened because he did know what I was, a woman, an old one who wouldn't fight back." Chuck didn't interrupt. He thought I wouldn't make trouble, that I'd be too proud or too scared or too tired to call him out. And he was almost right. She looked down at her bandaged arm. "But then you showed up." Chuck looked away briefly, his jaw tense. "I'm not proud of what I did," he said, "but I wasn't going to let him walk away thinking that was okay." Wilma leaned forward slightly. "I'm not asking you to be proud of it. I'm asking you to remember what it means." "What does it mean?" he asked. "That people are still watching. Even when they pretend they aren't, even when they look the other way, even when they film instead of act, they're still watching. And now they've seen it, the truth, raw and bleeding, on full display." Chuck sat back in his chair, nodding slowly. "They'll try to cover it up," he said. "They always do. But not this time," she said, "because this time the world saw it, not just the violence, but the dignity that stood through it." That night, the phones started ringing. First, it was a neighbor, then the pastor, then a city councilwoman, then a reporter, then another. By morning, local news stations were circling like birds above a fresh carcass, hoping for a statement, a soundbite, a reaction. Chuck took the calls, answering with calm professionalism, shielding his grandmother from the worst of the noise. By midday, footage from the alley was all over social media. It had been picked up by national outlets. Headlines started appearing: Sheriff assaults elderly woman in alley, didn't know she was Chuck Norris's grandmother. Some laughed at the irony. Others raged at the injustice. But no one dismissed it. Not anymore. The sheriff's office released a brief statement: "We are reviewing the incident and will follow all appropriate procedures." But the tide had already shifted. Complaints from other residents began surfacing. Past allegations against Cross that had gone unheeded were now receiving renewed attention. Old wounds reopened, and for the first time, they were being looked at with serious eyes. Later that evening, Wilma and Chuck sat on the porch, the sun melting into the horizon. The rocking chairs creaked in tandem. Fireflies flickered on the lawn. Wilma held a folded piece of paper in her hand, a letter she had written by hand earlier that day. She didn't read it aloud. She just held it there, fingers brushing its edges. "What is it?" Chuck asked softly. "A list of names," she said. "People who need to be in the room when this town starts talking." "Talking about what?" "Change." He nodded slowly. "I'll be here as long as you need me." She turned toward him with that same quiet smile she'd worn his whole life, the one that could calm him, shame him, and strengthen him all at once. "I don't need you to protect me anymore," she said. "I need you to help me speak louder." And as the stars began to blink open above the sleepy town of Ryan, Oklahoma, a reckoning took root, not with fists or flames, but with presence, with clarity, with the kind of strength that doesn't shatter, but holds steady, like a tree that has stood through every storm, still casting shade for those learning how to grow. The world had seen what happened in the alley. Now it was time for the town to decide what came next. The town of Ryan, Oklahoma, had always been a quiet place. Too quiet sometimes, if you ask the teenagers or the out-of-towners passing through on their way to somewhere that sparkled more. But in that quiet, there had always been order. And in that order, a sense of comfort, a rhythm. People waved to one another, whether they were friends or not. Children rode their bikes down sun-baked sidewalks. Church bells marked the time better than any watch. But after that day in the alley, something fundamental had shifted beneath that quiet surface, as if the town itself had blinked open new eyes. The morning after the video spread, Wilma Scarberry's porch became a focal point. Neighbors stopped by with casseroles and words they hadn't found the courage to speak the day before. They knocked with hesitation, unsure if they were coming to offer sympathy, congratulations, or something else entirely. Wilma received them with the same grace she always had, modest and composed, her spine straight despite the darkening bruise along her left collarbone. She didn't speak much, only enough to let them know she saw them and that she hadn't broken. Inside the house, Chuck had transformed the living room into a makeshift command center. Papers covered the dining table, printouts of city ordinances, press inquiries, public complaints. A notepad overflowed with bullet points and checkmarks. He fielded calls from state officials, attorneys, and journalists. The mayor had left 3 voicemails already, each more frantic than the last, asking for a meeting. There was a tremble in his voice he hadn't had before, the kind of tremble that appears when a man realizes that something bigger than him has started to move, and he doesn't know which direction to stand in. Chuck had been through media storms before. Decades of Hollywood had prepared him for cameras and narratives, but this wasn't about him. That, more than anything, made this moment different. This wasn't a premiere. It wasn't a project. This was his grandmother. This was home. And it was broken in ways that had been ignored for too long. Later that day, the sheriff's department issued a press release stating that Sheriff Cross had been placed on administrative leave pending a full investigation. It was a bureaucratic phrase, cold and empty, meant to placate. But the town wasn't in the mood for placation. Dozens of townspeople showed up at City Hall with printed screenshots of the video. Some spoke, some didn't. They didn't have to. Their presence alone sent a message. This wasn't going away quietly. At the same time, more stories began to surface. Whispers turned to voices, and voices to testimonies. A single mother recalled being followed by Cross for 3 blocks with no explanation. A teenager described being pulled over twice in the same week while walking, not driving. A retired postal worker remembered the sheriff speaking to him like a delinquent outside a convenience store. One after another, the stories piled up. For the first time, people realized they weren't isolated incidents. They were patterns. And Wilma's story, caught on camera and amplified by her grandson's sudden arrival, had unlocked something in the collective memory of the town. In the Scarberry living room, Wilma sat in her chair by the window with a notebook in her lap. Her handwriting was slow but precise, each letter formed with intention. The list she had started the night before grew longer: pastors, teachers, retired judges, community volunteers, parents, teenagers, store owners, former students. She was building a room, not a courtroom, not a protest, but a room where truth could finally speak without being ignored. Chuck watched her from the couch, a laptop open in front of him. He was coordinating with a civil rights organization based in Oklahoma City, arranging for legal support should it become necessary. But even as he typed, his eyes kept drifting to his grandmother, to the way she seemed unshaken in the face of the growing storm, like a lighthouse refusing to dim. In the following days, news vans began to appear at the edge of town, their long antennae poking at the sky like mechanical weeds. National outlets picked up the story. Reporters set up across from the alley, trying to frame the brick wall in the background of their segments. Some used Wilma's name with reverence. Others used it with sensationalism. A few called her Chuck Norris's grandmother, as if that was all that mattered. But those who knew her, and even many who didn't, understood quickly that this wasn't just about celebrity. This was about dignity. By the end of the week, the mayor held a public town meeting at the high school auditorium. It was the largest gathering the town had seen in years. Folding chairs filled the gymnasium. The stage was set with 2 long tables, microphones, and a podium. Local officials sat stiffly behind nameplates, their faces pale under the fluorescent lights. Cameras lined the back wall. And when Wilma entered the room, a hush rippled through the crowd like wind through wheat. She didn't speak first. She didn't need to. Others did: young women, elderly men, teenagers with shaking hands and clear eyes. One by one, they stepped to the microphone to recount their own stories, to add their threads to the tapestry of harm that had been woven so slowly no one had noticed until it was finished. The room held its breath through each one. When Wilma finally stood, she did so without theatrics. Her steps were measured, her face composed. She wore a navy dress, her brooch shaped like a dove pinned neatly at the collar. She placed a hand lightly on the podium and looked out across the sea of faces, some familiar, some not. "I've lived in Ryan all my life," she began, her voice calm and strong. "I've walked its sidewalks, taught its children, mourned with its families, and prayed in its churches. And in all that time, I've seen a lot of change. But what I saw last week wasn't change. It was a reminder of how much hasn't. I wasn't attacked because I raised my voice. I was attacked because I didn't lower it, because I didn't step aside, because I didn't disappear." There was no applause, no cheers, just a stillness that spoke louder than noise. Chuck sat in the front row, hands folded, his face unreadable, but his eyes fixed on her. She didn't look at him. She didn't need to. He was where he always was, within reach, but letting her speak. After the meeting, the mayor approached Chuck and Wilma quietly, away from the cameras. He offered a formal apology, but Wilma didn't accept it, not out of spite, but because it wasn't enough. "This doesn't end with words," she told him. "It ends with structure, with action." True to that, the very next morning, Chuck submitted a proposal to the city council calling for the creation of a civilian oversight board, one that would review police conduct, investigate complaints, and ensure transparency. Wilma's name was listed first on the nomination list. By the end of the day, the petition had over 600 signatures. In a town of under 2,000, that was a roar. A few officers in the sheriff's department resigned, citing stress or unfair treatment by the media. Others stayed, and for the first time, attended a community listening session hosted in the same church where Wilma had once taught Sunday school. The conversations were difficult. Emotions ran high, but they were real. And in that honesty, something fragile but vital began to take root. Chuck held the first self-defense workshop at the local community center the following week. He didn't advertise it with his name. He didn't charge a fee. He just showed up, brought some mats, and opened the door. Wilma sat in the back with a clipboard, registering names and handing out waivers. Teenagers came, mothers came, even a few older men came, their joints stiff, but their spirits determined. Wilma watched it all, quietly proud. She hadn't asked to become a symbol. She didn't want a statue or a holiday or a headline. What she wanted, what she demanded, was something simple: safety with dignity, justice with humility, and a town that remembered its soul. As the sun dipped low over the prairie that evening, painting the sky with streaks of gold and rose, Wilma walked alone to the alley where everything had begun. She didn't stop when she reached the wall. She didn't flinch when she saw the faint mark where her shoulder had struck brick. Instead, she placed her hand gently against the stone, let it rest there for a moment, and whispered something only the wind heard. Then she turned and walked home. The town had woken up, and this time, it intended to stay awake. The morning after Wilma Scarberry placed her hand on the brick wall where it had all started, the sun rose quietly, as if aware that it was rising over new ground. The wind was cool, whispering through the magnolia trees, and for a moment, the town of Ryan held its breath again, not in fear, not in denial, but in anticipation. Something had shifted, not like an earthquake that cracks the earth in one brutal moment, but like a slow, deliberate turning of the tide. The people were no longer simply residents. They had become witnesses, and with witnessing came responsibility. Inside the Scarberry home, the mood was sober but focused. Wilma sat at the kitchen table in a pressed gray blouse, her reading glasses perched low on her nose, a notepad open before her. She sipped from her tea slowly, occasionally making small notes with a black ballpoint pen. Across from her, Chuck had just ended a call with a city official, his face lined with a calm determination that had only grown sharper over the last week. "They've agreed to a public hearing," he said finally. "The council's going to vote on the oversight board next Tuesday. They're expecting a full room." Wilma nodded, not in surprise, but in understanding. "Good. Then it's time to make sure it's not just a performance. It won't be, not with you there." "I don't need to be the face of it," she said, folding her hands gently. "But I do need to make sure the doors don't close when the cameras stop rolling." Word had already spread, flyers posted at the library, the post office, the gas station, announcements made after church services, radio hosts talking between country songs. Tuesday would be the moment the town could either step forward or slide back into the quiet comfort of that evening. Wilma visited the community center again, not to speak, but to listen. Parents voiced concerns about policing in school zones. A black farmer from the outskirts of town described how he'd been pulled over twice in 1 month on the same road he'd used for years. A teenage girl in a hoodie stood with her arms crossed and told the room how she didn't call the police when her bike was stolen because they don't show up for people like me. Each story added a new thread to the tapestry Wilma had been stitching since the alley. Chuck, as always, stood quietly in the back, watching, not looming, not performing, just present. His presence reminded people that accountability could come with grace, that strength didn't need to shout, that justice could wear worn boots and carry a clipboard. 2 days before the vote, something unexpected arrived at Wilma's front porch: a bouquet of lilies wrapped in brown paper, tied with a blue ribbon. No card, just the flowers. She stood there for a long time, staring at them, the same kind that had fallen to the ground when Cross shoved her, the same kind that had scattered across the pavement like small white witnesses. She didn't bring them inside. Instead, she placed them in a glass jar and left them on the porch, not as a trophy, but as a reminder. Tuesday came with an overcast sky and the threat of rain. Still, the town gathered. The council chamber overflowed with bodies standing in the back, sitting on windowsills, leaning against walls. The news crews were there, but they didn't lead the moment. The people did. Local clergy sat in one corner, young mothers in another. A group of high school students had made signs, simple ones: "We see you, protect the people," and one that read simply, "Wilma." The mayor opened the meeting with a strained voice, reading from a typed statement about transparency, public trust, and the importance of listening. But when he invited Wilma to the podium, the room shifted again. Shoulders straightened, heads lifted, eyes sharpened. She stepped forward slowly, with no notes this time, no paper in her hands, just her. The same woman who had once taught spelling and arithmetic in a one-room classroom, the same woman who had refused to fall in an alley when pressed against stone, the same woman who, for nearly 8 decades, had carried herself as if dignity were a garment no one could tear. "I'm not here because of what happened to me," she began. "I'm here because of what that moment revealed about power, about silence, about the spaces we walk through thinking we're safe until someone reminds us we're not." She paused, letting the words breathe. "The oversight board isn't a punishment. It's a promise that this town sees its people, that this town listens, that this town doesn't wait until it's someone famous or someone beloved or someone lucky enough to be caught on video. We all know what justice should feel like. We teach our children about fairness, but we forget to practice it with our laws. Today is your chance to change that." She stepped back. No applause, just stillness again, that sacred hush that only appears when truth is spoken plainly. The vote passed unanimously. By the end of the week, the first civilian oversight board in the county was formed. Wilma was named honorary chair, though she declined the title. "Give it to someone younger," she said. "Someone who will be here long after I'm gone." She agreed to serve as advisor instead, and people knew that meant she'd be at every meeting anyway. The reforms didn't end there. Within the month, new training modules were introduced for local law enforcement, centered on de-escalation, cultural competency, and community relations. Officers were required to attend town forums quarterly. Complaints against the sheriff's department were made public record, with response timelines enforced by policy. At the next town fair, Wilma didn't attend as a guest of honor. She came like she always had, with her canvas cart and a grocery list. But something had changed. As she walked between stalls, people didn't just wave. They approached her. They didn't just thank her. They asked her what came next. She pointed them to the bulletin board outside the library, where the next board meeting was posted. "It doesn't matter if you have something polished to say," she told one young man. "It matters that you say it." Chuck, watching from a distance, felt a pride he couldn't put into words, not pride in her strength, he had always known that, but in how that strength had become something larger than the moment, how it had become structure. In early autumn, the school invited Wilma to speak to the senior civics class. She arrived with her notebook, a small stack of newspaper clippings, and a mason jar of tea. She stood before a room of wide-eyed students, most of whom had seen the video, all of whom had felt the ripple effects. "Laws matter," she said, "but what matters more is how they're made, who's in the room when they're written, who they protect, and who they ignore." A student raised their hand. "What made you finally speak up?" "I always spoke," she answered. "The difference is, this time, you were ready to hear it." As fall deepened and the leaves began to brown, Wilma continued her routine: church on Sundays, walks through the town square, evenings on the porch. But now, when she passed the alley on Hawthorne, something else greeted her: a mural, painted quietly one weekend by a group of local artists. It showed a woman standing tall, her face turned upward, her hand pressed against a brick wall. Behind her, a town watching. Below, in small white letters, were the words, "She stood, and we followed." Wilma said nothing when she first saw it. She simply paused, ran her fingers along the painted lines, then walked on. Justice hadn't come all at once. It hadn't come cleanly. But it had come. And it came in the name of a woman who never needed a badge to remind the world she mattered. She had her name. And now the law did, too. If this story moved you, don't forget to like and subscribe to Real Stories Diary. Tap the bell so you never miss a new release. Share this video with someone who believes in quiet strength and real justice. And let us know in the comments what moment hit you the hardest. Real Stories Diary wants to connect with you.